if you don't have the hippocampus, or if you have some trouble, you're almost in a perpetual present. Rats with hippocampal damage were slaves to temporal contiguity alone and were, in effect, highly superstitious.
And if you're a superstitious animal and you happen to experience one of those times when A is followed by B, you will conclude that A causes B or that A leads to B. You will not take into account the fact that A happened a lot on its own and B happened a lot on its own. Your memories, you are your memories. Your memories are in constant dialogue with the real world, basically. Well, that's a fundamental decision the brain is making, all the time. How does it do that? And when it decides to update, what are the mechanisms that determine how it updates a memory so that it sort of deletes the things that are no longer relevant and adds new things that are now relevant versus when it's creating a brand new memory?
If we did think of the hippocampus as a way that we're somehow connected to communication in the way we were talking about, then it would also make a lot of sense to those points you were making about possibly extending the circle of care.
And I think the claim we made is that we create a psychological space that fits what Kant said, not that the physical space is actually like that. I mean, in the real world, who knows what's the case? We're just talking about what the human brain, but obviously what the vertebrate brain or the mammalian brain, and not just the mammalian brain, because insects have the same thing. What brains in mobile animals do. Now, would you say, do plants have a cognitive map? I would have to say the answer is probably no, right? Although I think plants demonstrate many of the same cognitive phenomena like memory, and so on that we do, but they don't have a cognitive map because they don't really need one, not for space, because they're not moving, right? Anything that moves in the world, in some intentional way, needs to have something like a cognitive mapping system in order to benefit from its prior experience.
Okay, everybody. So today is another bonus episode with Lynn Nadel, psychologist and neuroscientist. And I think this is the fourth talk. We've had more than that, but this is the fourth one that's publishing. And as you know, I'm crazy about the hippocampus, and he's a really important researcher in that field. So we've talked quite a few times about a lot of subjects. He's not the only hippocampal area researcher that has been on this show, but he's been on the most for sure, and I really appreciate him. And today is a really interesting one because we talk about all kinds of subjects that have a lot of deep roots, and I thought to begin I would just tell you about some of those roots. Those of you who don't want to hear all the philosophy and neuroscience and hear me talking through some things as I want to do today for my research, you can skip ahead. But since this is basically a podcast exploring my ideas and research, which are all inspired by all of these people in a different context, it's important for me to go through all this. But you're welcome to skip ahead to Lynn. It's about 58 minutes, our whole conversation. So just go to wherever you are, about 1 hour from the end, and you'll hear it. For those of you who want to hear the rest, then I want to talk about this idea of transcending the here and now, or the present moment, because that's a big part of hippocampal research. For example, when there's lesions with HM and others, Clive Waring, important people in the patients, people who've given a lot to hippocampal research, often when they have trouble, they end up sort of living in the present moment, which might sound wonderful, but it's not, because it's a very limited, it's like everything is refreshing every 20 seconds or every 2 minutes even, but still it's refreshing. And that means that you don't know where you are. Suddenly it's like waking up over and over again, or just kind of being in a little bit of a almost dream state where you kind of feel like you know what's happening, but you don't really. That's how they describe it in a way. So how does this relate to space and to memory? This really intrigues me. It's a lot of what I think about. And also just those words, space and memory. Those are words that point to something that we all recognize and have in common, but we have to detach ourselves a little bit from those words because we're already sort of nesting a lot of our ideas together when we talk about those words. We're describing a process that's already all of that. And that's part of this holding paradox idea and why it's so hard to talk about, especially with something like memory, because we've broken it into all kinds of different ways of thinking about it, episodic or declarative or associative or working memory, all these different ways we've thought about how to understand the way it manifests, the way a process manifests by which we are able to understand that we're in a continuous ongoing process, and we can use whatever we've been through in the past towards whatever we're going to be going through in the future. That's really what we're talking about when we're talking about memory. And where that's happening is what we're talking about with space. But it might not always be geographical. This is what we're starting to learn. Of course, we're always in a geographical space, but we're also, there's many layered spaces as that geographical space, as our body encountering everything it encounters. There's conceptual space, for example, when we're measuring it, it's all one ongoing thing, not even one, it's all ongoing, not one and not two. But when we study it, we might study it like conceptual space or virtual space, or, these different areas where we spend a lot of our time. If you think about it, when you go on the computer, you're sort of in virtual space, but of course you're also in geographical space and emotional space and all these other ways that we've divided it. But if I want to know something about the way your body is reacting when you're clicking through websites or moving through the social apps, those are kinds of spaces or landscapes, I call them, which have particular regularities in which your body is interacting with as you go through those spaces, just to speak of it as if it's geographical. So these are all kind of nesting together, and maybe memory is the word that we use to describe our awareness of those habits, is a kind of a nice way to think of it, which I bring up here with Lynn a bit too. But they're binding us, but they're not really binding us because it's all one ongoing process. But when we study it, we can see these habits that are going through our body, but also that we really see in the hippocampus with the action that we encounter. So when we're talking about the hippocampus, which is you have two of them in both sides of your brain, in the temporal lobe, the hippocampi, they're definitely doing something very important relative to your sensory body and all that you're encountering, and how that aligns with all you've encountered before as your body. And maybe that's not about storage in the sense that like your hippocampus is putting something in some little suitcase somewhere in your body. Maybe it's more that it's an ongoing process of such amazing intricacy that we can't really get it yet, but that actually your body itself is that storage in quotation marks, such that somehow at many different dimensions, your body, and especially your central nervous system, with the hippocampal formation playing a very big part of this, is somehow reading all that sensory ongoing encounter all as one and aligning it with all that you've become as you've been moving to where you are now. So I know that's really hard to understand, but it's just thinking of memory not as storage, but maybe this process that's like liberating us in a way from being bound to the present, as those people who've had hippocampal damage are, where they just keep refreshing. We still have this continuity of connection, of communication with our body, which it represents, or not doesn't represent, but is everything we've ever been through. So remembering the past, imagining the future, those aren't actually maybe so different for the body or for the hippocampus. And there's a whole lot of research on both of those relative to the hippocampus. So, but that would be a whole other discussion. But, this is kind of habituation from all you've been through to all you might go through. And of course, it's not just the hippocampus, it's, doing that, but it's playing a very big role, which we see in studies and which we see in the cells, the way the neurons fire. And it's pretty exciting. So maybe memories are communication with ourselves. That's how I like to think of it. And we experience it as thinking or as action at times, but it's not only like we think of our memory as what we remember, as remembering our first love, our first kiss, those cookies our grandmother made us, whatever it might be. But that is part of it. But also we're remembering all the time as our body, just the way we can move around and know how to do things. And that's also memory, but it's not that kind of memory that most of us think of all memory. We experience that thinking, but we're also part of a nested ongoing remembering, but also an imagining, predicting, all these words we use in various areas of neuroscience that I'm trying to start to understand as one ongoing process, or a lot of people are trying to do that, but we're trying to articulate it in a way such that It's not about finding little stored things in the body so much as understanding these habits that we create and understanding how that becomes something like thinking and the ability to communicate with your own self, to be aware of your own past habits and experiences at many different levels, many of which are these episodic memories of remembering your first love, or remembering a poem, whatever. There's semantic memory too. So there's a lot of different ways to think about this, but this is why I brought up this idea of constellation cognition, or this metaphor of the kaleidoscope often, because it helps us to get out of this way of thinking in contrast only, and instead think of all these different layers and dimensions of an ongoing process that's going on, that our awareness, our communication with ourselves can switch through and understand in different ways instead of either or formulations. And that's why I always use this Gregory Bateson, it takes two to know one, because even when we're communicating with ourselves, there's already a third. There's all of it. There's this part of us that's aware of ourselves, and there's what we're aware of. And all of that actually is coming through our conversations, our encounters with the world, with all these other beings around us. So you can't really take all this away. And that's why we talk about relation so much on this podcast, and participatory sense making, and all of these forms of bodily cognition, and also why computation is so important, and why we need models and ways to represent and think about all of this together. Because wow, what a process, But anyway, those positions allow us to have other kind of positions of three, like past, present, and future, or body, brain, and world. So this is about action at a distance. So let me think about this through an analogy that might seem a little bit strange, but just bear with me and I'll try and bring it round, because it is part of the paper that Lynn and I talk about, which is called the Hippocampal Formation and Action at a Distance. So I want you to imagine two particles, like whatever you want to imagine as a particle, I don't care. And they've interacted and they've become so connected that they're instantly in sync. One changes and the other changes, no matter how far apart they move, because somehow they've gotten into the same rhythm. And so it's not about how far away they are so much as that their bodies are, as particles, their particle bodies are in complete synchrony with one another, even as they travel across the universe, And this is called quantum entanglement. And of course, I'm giving you a very cartoon example, but actually, we know it exists. It's a really hard thing to say exists. Even Einstein didn't like to admit that this exists. He called it spooky action at a distance, which Lynn talks about as well, because it just seems so weird to suggest that information or some kind of influence could leap across what seems like space for us, this, great distances, maybe even faster than anything else, like light or something. So when we measure a property like spin or one entangled particle, then we find out the other one that's entangled with it already knows that, so to speak. It's already also reacted as having known that, even if it's, on the moon and you're here. So this isn't about signals traveling. It's about they're in a similar state, and that state changes, so they both change. It doesn't mean they necessarily are exactly the same. It just means they are in constant communication. That's that word again. It's almost like a translation that's happening at some kind of speed or some kind of immediacy that we really don't understand yet, or we don't know how to put into math, at least. And we talk about that as quantum. And of course, that gets all kinds of wonderful connotations. Think about quantum. But it is mysterious. And memory is also mysterious. And the way that we remember and imagine, and the way this is also kind of immediate, right? And we know that the hippocampal formation is part of this. So it can seem kind of crazy to think about these together. And I'm not saying the hippocampus is quantum, but who knows? And Lynn's not necessarily saying that either. But I guess what is happening is that there are these connections that we've broken down into memory, space, and time. But if we kind of unstick ourselves from those words and understand this is an ongoing process, then we might begin to understand that the hippocampus can tell us something about that. At least our research about it is opening ways for us to think about how we're performing this action at a distance in a way. Because, we go to a coffee shop that we don't see, we step out of the way of some kind of car or something, we make a plan to go home for Christmas. And without our hippocampus, we wouldn't be doing all of that. We would be reliving the moment, and we might still have some ability to communicate with our old habits that we made before we had whatever, before we lost our hippocampus, but we wouldn't be able to attach anything new to that. It's almost like a gulf has opened up, and we can no longer align what's going on now with everything in our body that's happened before. So that's that permanent present tense that Lynn talks about, and that Sukokin talks about with HM. And it's, trying to figure this out. How do we bridge these gaps between where we are, where we want to be, who we are right now in this moment, which again aren't really gaps, but when you have something happen to your hippocampus, then you notice that it was doing something that now has left something that can't be done, which is kind of feeling like a gap in the way that I just described. So how does that have anything to do with entanglement? Well, entanglement defies what we think of as space and time, and so does memory. And that's hard to talk about in the same way it's hard to talk about entanglement, especially because it's so intimate to us and it's so rich with research and data and possibility. And yet we can't quite get a grasp of it. I think Lynn is offering in this paper a way to think of memory as a kind of mediation in the way that we're assessing it. Again, it's not like actually something we can separate from all this, but it's a mediation that is that kind of bridging between past and future and present. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, even if you only want to think about it like that metaphorically. But it does challenge our intuitive sense that there's something stored and stuck somewhere that we pull out and read, and all of this, in the same way that two particles being on opposite sides of the earth that still know what one another are doing challenges us. It seems to, and Lynn doesn't say this, but I think his paper shows this actually, that it seems to force us to believe that this is ongoing and inseparable, and we can actually separate our remembering from our bodies and what our bodies are encountering, which we would call space and time. And again, Lynn doesn't exactly say that, but I say that in my work, and I build on Lynn's work because I see it in his work, and he gets it, and he hasn't said I'm wrong. So yeah, you'll hear us talk about it. We've been talking about it. This is like the 4th hour, and there's many more, so it's ongoing. But one thing Lynn does talk about is Kant, and I like Kant a lot. He's a philosopher. Some of you probably know all of his work better than I do, but some of you might not have heard of him. He's a German philosopher, maybe one of the most important. And you probably all know I love Hegel. So let's connect it to Hegel because those two are very connected. But Lynn really likes Immanuel Kant. And let's just step back for a minute and think about him. So he argued that space and time are not things existing out there, like independently, or at least this is how people take it. But remember all that stuff I just said too, because we're changing, we're moving, we're learning, since Immanuel Kant. But it's a very important idea he had that space and time aren't out there. They're not a priori is the kind of word. They are a priori. They're immediate. They're intuitive is more the word he might use, or some people might say mental. But as I was just telling you, maybe those aren't separate. But for Kant, when he was trying to understand them, he was separating them. And he was going against what most people usually say, which they're something out there. And then, you have the in here, which processes it or whatever. So he was basically saying, that out there is actually immediate. I'm just talking off the top of my head, by the way. So you want to check all of this. But this is just as I understand it after having just read Lynn's paper again, which you can see I've marked all up. Try to take a picture of it for you. It's a good paper. Anyway, try to stay focused here. But this a priori intuition, these mental structures that our minds impose on, I guess is the way I would say it, on the encountering. Raw experience is probably what they say. Raw experience. So our minds impose this on raw experience before we really perceive anything. And Nadel invokes this in his work. So does John O'Keefe. They talk about this in that book, Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map from 1978, which we've talked about a lot here. And you can read for free, by the way, online if you want to. So Lynn and John talk about this. They write through the hippocampal processes that I think I wrote the quote down. I wrote a bunch of quotes down because I wanted to. Our subjective sense of both space and time are interwoven constructions of the mind, much as the philosopher Immanuel Kant postulated. He actually says that in this paper, Lynn does. The neuroscience seems to validate this insight, I guess. If you think about grid cells in the entorhinal cortex, they kind of create, or code is the word we use, the spatial structure that's internally generated. It's the brain. It is the brain. It's the brain's neurons. And that seems to scaffold this external environment, which you could, or they do say, is kind of what Kant was saying. So it's almost like saying this is almost saying that our inner world, our brain, is scaffolding what we encounter out there, as if it's not out there. But what I'm saying, or what I was trying to open up before, and what I think Lynn and John's work opens up, actually, even if they don't think that, is that this is an immediacy, and that these are both happening. This is holding the paradox, right? You have this scaffolding of the body that is the body and the brain, and you also have the encountering. And those aren't choice. You don't make a choice between those. How does that have to do with Hegel? Well, I wonder if you listened to my talk with Karen about Hegel. I'll link to all the stuff. But anyway, Hegel's got this idea, which is, I'll way oversimplify it and say thesis, antithesis, synthesis, because that's what most people understand. And it's actually pretty good just to think of it like that. But it's actually a triadic formula, more like what I was trying to express before, that it takes two to know one, and that there's actually no one or two or three. It's not one or not two, and not three either, by the way, and not four. Sorry, fourth way. It's not, you don't number, you number it to understand it, but there's no beginning or end. In any case, there's something about the communication and the relation that we understand through putting numbers on it. And 3 is a really important one for all of us. How many people have used triads? Everyone. And Hegel's one, very important triadic formula. It actually comes from Fichte, but anyway, Hegel considered it his sort of schema, or I consider it his sort of schema. And it's this dynamic, immanent, or to name a word a lot of people like these days, space where contradictions unfold and are realized at the same time that they shift into other contradictions, all from the position of assessment, not from actually what's happening. But we need to assess it. That's that communication, right? That becoming aware of it and communicating, which is, of course, always part of it, which is why you can't absolutely measure it. And that's why Hegel's so hard to understand, and also so wonderful, because this truth, or whatever, this process, is emerging from that structure that we understand through the triad, even though it's not inherently triadic. So in the same way that it's not in here or out there or some kind of whole that synthesizes those, it's through holding the understanding that it's going on in what seem like both oppositional spaces at once, that you then open this third, which is kind of the portal by which you have an epiphany or an understanding of the process itself, which doesn't require parts and isn't a whole, in the sense of it's not one, it's not two. So wow, that's hard to understand, but think of it as a synthesis if it's easier. It's really more like a sublation. But anyway, all these are just words, and what's important is that we understand that contradictions aren't the end of anything, and that, in fact, realizing contradictions is itself already a movement beyond them when you notice them and let them be what they are. So you're not eliminating poles, you're recognizing them, and in that recognition, what I think of as the constellation opens many more levels and options and possibilities. And that's why waymaking is an approach that's about that space, that holding, and all this I'm talking about already. And that's what I've been thinking about with this constellation, where you have at least 3, right? But when you're assessing and you're moving beyond the opposition without trying to solve it. So that's like noticing the polarities, beginning to imagine them not as dual poles, but as parts that they've gotten our attention for a reason, and if we let them be, a portal will open, just to get a little mystical, and we'll actually see, wow, oh, these things we thought were two open into a constellation, or they change into, the kaleidoscope shifts, and we see many, many other different visions. I guess I should try to put that in more scientific terms, which you can find. Well, actually, I'm not going to, because if you really want to hear the science about how this relates to the hippocampus, you can go somewhere else, because we want to get to Lynn's talk. But I do argue that the hippocampus enables not just this binary dialectic, but it's more like a kaleidoscope, as a metaphor, as a way of understanding it. Of course, it's much richer and more amazing than a kaleidoscope could ever be. But the way that a kaleidoscope shifts is just that pattern, might help us understand how this body and this central nervous system is encountering the world sensorially and shifting that constantly into what it already is as the body. And this never stops. And that is memory, and that is imagination, and that is being present and aware. And when we are present and aware, we can shift what we know of the past and the future. So that's all very interesting. And the hippocampal formation and action at a distance, just to try to come back to Lynn and his paper, is making some steps towards that, towards understanding that more constellatory nature of everything, and also the way that we can talk about it in neuroscience, because that's important too. You probably know I've written about representations, and the way we talk about it in our language is often keeping us stuck in that outside inside, looking for things inside that somehow correspond to things outside view. So what I see in this paper is that, which you can watch a video, by the way, that Lynn did, where he talks a lot about the entanglement and stuff, which I will also link to. But let me just try and connect it back to that quantum entanglement now too. So that shows us that the spatial separation isn't some kind of absolute thing. If two particles on other sides of the world can be communicating without what we understand as traveling through space and time in a logical way, then there's some kind of other thing going on. So it's not absolute spatial separation, at least in the way we know it. And, particles can be connected at fundamental levels across distances. So, and then we have Kant, who argued that the experience of space and time are like mental constructions, or at least that's where the reality is of it, which I don't agree with. But I love Kant, and I think he was an important step towards this realization. So anyway, but it's not direct perceptions of reality as it is in itself, he would say. It's, this mental, ongoing, categorical imperative. And the hippocampus, as Nadel and O'Keefe demonstrate, is like the biological mechanism that stitches together, he says. He uses this, stitches together this spatiotemporally disparate experiences, right? Because if it's all happening inside, then we have to stitch together all these different experiences that we're having and create this subjective sense of, ongoing coherent space and time, the out there. And this would be the mediation for the action at a distance. It's bridging the gaps. But, if we think of Hegel again, he showed those contradictions aren't actual contradictions. They're ways of understanding an ongoing process. So what happens then? What happens if we let all of that be true, and Kant and all of that they've said, and we're still moving forward and knowing, right? We're still learning more. So we don't need to say all of that is wrong, but maybe there's another way of seeing it. Maybe what we thought of as either or is going to open into a constellation now. But all of us, including Lynn and I, are grappling with basically this mystery, which is as mysterious as what Einstein called spooky action at a different distance, as entanglement. Because it's like, how are we so connected to what is so separate from us, or what we think of as so separate from us, and how our space and time and memory all here as us, part of us, and not out there or out there or in here. All of this kind of amazing ability we have to communicate with ourselves and one another and actually know this process, and in knowing it, change it. So let's now think about that 1978 book, which I've talked about so much here, called The Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map. And I wrote down some quotes from it, because Lynn talks about it here, and I wanted to have some quotes from it. And Hippocampus is a cognitive map. They were really already thinking about these issues then in 1978. So even before then, because that's when it was published. So this is like 50 years on, pretty cool. Okay, so here's what they say at the very beginning of the book, because you'll hear Lynn talk about how they said this on page 1, and he's right. So here it is. This book is concerned with 3 topics which at first glance do not appear to be related. 1, a part of the brain known as the hippocampus. 2, the psychological representation of space. 3, context-dependent memory. And in this book, we shall argue that the hippocampus is the core of a neural memory system, providing an objective spatial framework within which the items and events of an organism's experience are located and interrelated. So they were already thinking about memory as a system for connecting all these different experiences, or maybe just the system is what we study as this connective, communicative process. And there's quite a lot of insights in this book that resonate with all that I'm always talking about here, but also with what Lynn and I talk about here. And I wrote some notes, so I'm just going to read those. So when I've been talking about the gaps in action at a distance, well, here's a quote that's interesting in that regard. The place system permits an animal to locate itself in a familiar environment without reference to any specific sensory input, to go from one place to another independent of particular inputs or outputs, which are cues and responses, and to think together conceptually parts of an environment, to link together conceptually parts of an environment which have never been experienced at the same time. So that's action at a distance. And then this whole stitching mechanism, which I don't think the hippocampus is doing any stitching. I think it's more like a translator. I think of this as better to think of it as communication. And the hippocampus is like the translator of this ongoing sensory encounter with all that the body is from past sensory encounters. But anyway, here's the quote. We shall call the system which generates this absolute space a cognitive map, and will identify it with the hippocampus. This system underlies the notion of absolute unitary space, which is a non-centered stationary framework through which the organism and its egocentric spaces move. Okay, well, that's holding some paradox, but they're trying to relate it to this inside-outside, but I think they're already starting to hold it in the way that I suggest. Here's another quote about the Kantian absolute space from that book. In contrast to this view, we think that the concept of absolute space is primary and that its elaboration does not depend upon prior notions of relative space. There exists at least one neural system which provides the basis for an integrated model of the environment. This system underlies the notion of absolute unitary space. And you can see what I'm doing. I think they were already on to a lot of important ideas here that have been really hard for us to articulate, but that have a lot to do with what I think of as constellation cognition or constellation thinking, or this hippocampus as a translator. So anyway, and when I say hippocampus, I really mean the hippocampus and all its confederates, as Lynn puts it in the article. The hippocampus, the hippocampal formation, the entorhinal cortex, all of that. Anyway, here's a quote. Each new item which is located on a map is automatically related to every other place and item already on the map. A change in a feature of the landscape occasions only a single alteration in a map, yet it changes every route statement in which that feature occurs. That's a little bit technical, but wow, that's really wonderful. I just need to put this here just for my notes too, because I think that's really, really talking about that function of translation, actually, that flexibility and that shifting of the kaleidoscope and that constellation. Another one I wrote down, which I think has to do with object-dependent stuff, which has some relation to other podcasts we've done. So the constituents of space are places. Places and space are not, in our view, defined in terms of objects or the relations between objects. The absolute space defined by Kant exists in the absence of objects. This freedom from reference to any specific object or set of objects is one of the most important properties of maps. Okay, awesome. But the map is not necessarily located anywhere. It's our communication with our own habits, our own body, our own everything we've ever gone through, which has molded or sculpted our body at so many levels and so many dimensions, which is a little bit like storage. Then this one, just because of this across time dimension. So here's a quote. Since each representation of a stimulus is encoded in terms of its spatial relations to other stimuli, an identical stimulus occurring in different parts of the same environment or in totally different environments will have distinct and differentiable representations in each case. This, of course, is the way in which a spatiotemporal framework solves, by its very structure, the problem of re-identification so central to our philosophical discussion. And then, gosh, how many did I write down? Okay, one more. We have organized this chapter around the dichotomy between absolute and relative space in the hope of showing how the choice of either of these as prior crucially influences the ability of any theory to cope with space perception. It seems reasonable to conclude first that there is a clear need for the concept of unitary space. Further, and again, I think by unitary space, that's like the ongoingness, the not necessarily something with a beginning or an end. Further, it appears that this framework cannot be acquired through experience. It must be available soon after birth, for the process of localization, identification, and the coherent organization of experience depend upon it. Okay, so that's very Kantian, that you're born with this. And actually, a lot of work with the Moser lab, as Lynn mentions here, I think they're finding that you're born with this scaffolding, so to speak. But of course, because we are bodies, that doesn't actually mean that there's nothing out there that you're encountering. I think that's a very important thing not to overlook, that you can have a scaffolding because of course you are a body. And also you're encountering the real world, which is going to shift and mold that. In a way, it's just kind of common sense, but a lot of these things are hard to articulate through the data. So, all right, so that was, the book from 1978. Isn't that amazing? 50 years ago. And they were already conceptualizing the hippocampus as a system for bridging spatio-temporal gaps and thinking about this spatial framework that isn't necessarily derived from experience that we're born with, which is the body, but also that experience molds or shapes as we communicate with ourselves and with that world. So it's translating that world into what it's born with, or vice versa, right? It's using the scaffold to translate the world to itself because it's always going in a lot of different directions at once. So it's this kind of flexible constellation or this constellatory system that's flexible, but that's providing, re-identification or just identification that we can communicate with ourselves through as we move through the world and through life. And when you have something wrong with the hippocampus, it disrupts that clearly. Now, finally, let's get to this 2021 paper, which is the one that Lynn and I talk about here. And this is called The Hippocampal Formation and Action at a Distance. It's from 2021. And I think it's deepening all these insights and switching them towards the constellatory framework. And just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of the paper, because it has a lot to do with our conversation, I think I should read a few pieces from the paper so you don't have to read it, but just so you understand what we're referring to. And also that you know what Lynn actually wrote back then and what he's saying now, which is a little bit different at times. So, yeah, let's see. What did I put those quotes? Okay, I'll just read them, the ones I have here. The question of why our conceptions of space and time are intertwined with memory in the hippocampal formation is at the forefront of much current theorizing about this brain system. In this article, I argue that animals bridge spatial and temporal gaps through the creation of internal models that allow them to act on the basis of things that exist in a distant place and/or existed at a different time. The hippocampal formation plays a critical role in these processes by stitching together spatio-temporally disparate entities and events. It does this by 1. Constructing cognitive maps that represent extended spatial contexts, incorporating and linking aspects of an environment that may never have been experienced together. So you see there's this kind of stitching together of things that seem to be happening in different areas at the same time. 2. Creating neural trajectories that link the parts of an event, whether they occur in close temporal proximity or not, enabling the construction of event representations even when elements of that event were experienced at quite different times. And 3, using these maps and trajectories to simulate possible futures. As a function of these hippocampally driven processes, our subjective sense of both space and time are interwoven constructions of the mind, much as the philosopher Immanuel Kant postulated. Okay, I would say that's one side, and the other side is that it's also they're not constructions of the mind in the sense of only being in the mind. They're also constructions of the ongoing encounter and of the encounter itself. The encounter is also structuring. But anyway, okay. And then Lynn says in the paper, mediated action at a distance is central to much of what psychologists care about, given that behavior is frequently motivated by things that are at a spatial and/or temporal remove from the here and now. I will argue that mediating action at a distance is so important that a brain system centered on the hippocampal formation is largely devoted to carrying it out. So you see this wonderful turn where he's really saying whatever's happening here is this process of the three that I described earlier, this way that we have past, present, future, that we can even communicate with ourselves as that, or, here, there, elsewhere, whatever you want to put on it. But also he talks about Suzanne Corkin's book, and he says, without a hippocampal formation, I will argue, organisms are largely incapable of escaping the here and now, a state of being captured quite well in the title of Susan Corkin's book about the famous amnesic patient, HM, present, permanent present tense. And finally, last quote of the day. This is from Lynn in this book paper that we're talking about. Nearly 45 years ago, we proposed the cognitive map theory of hippocampal function. Spurred by the discovery of O'Keefe and Ostrovsky of place cells in the hippocampus, this theory spelled out the ways in which the brain structure and its neighbors allowed organisms to move about and explore space and to store in memory specific experiences that played out over time. Much has been discovered about the hippocampus and its neural confederates since then, most of which is consistent with the broad outlines of cognitive map theory. But one enigma remains. Why is it that the same neural system is so intimately involved in aspects of space and time and memory? So you see, why is that? It's a little bit like asking, how can this same part of the brain be so important for both navigation and memory? But of course it is. So anyway, he talks about, how animals with hippocampal damage became sort of locked or trapped in this temporal moment of contiguity, feeling alone. And he relates that to superstition, which is really interesting because a lot of diseases where we become paranoid or we have certain hallucinations that are relative to superstition do affect it, can come from damage to this area. And that has to do with the way we connect events together and this kind of pattern matching or fitting to that is the body. That's a really interesting point that's brought up here too. And how we understand, how we distinguish and communicate with our context and with ourselves is really important. So let's go to today's conversation. And it's like 50 years now since that 1978 book that Nadel and John wrote. Actually, it's not 50 years since 1978, but it's 50 years since they started writing the book and thinking about it, because of course these things take time before they are published. And it's that's when they first started this cognitive map theory, and when O'Keefe had his amazing findings with the place cells. And so now we're only beginning to really understand this and rethink memory through a lot of people's work, like Yuri Bazaki and John Kuby was on the podcast, and a lot of these people, Brad Love, a lot of people have been working on this from different angles, computational, but also just theoretical and always in the lab. And so we talk about here how this these ideas and how the hippocampus might be accomplishing this, so to speak, and what it all really means, and how we're linking events across space and time. And yeah, the main evolution, I guess, is when we think of what I think he's expressing here with the action as at a distance is almost like a Gibson kind of ecological immediacy that I think, and again, Lynn does not say this, but that I see also it kind of helps us explain how this is actually happening as a process, and how the body itself in its encountering is doing a lot that we think or thought had to happen through something like a representation. So, it's all threaded together in our studies of it. It is the same process, and space and time aren't separate scaffolds, neither are memory and navigation. But when we study them, we need to break them into those because it's just too overwhelming, and we're part of it. So we have to do this. And how do we realize we're doing that as we're doing it? Anyway, the hippocampus is still this amazing translator, also just metaphorically a beautiful thing to look at when you look at the research. And both that 1978 book and this 2021 paper are open access, and you can all read them yourself and decide what you think about them. And I would love to encourage you to do that, and also share what you think about it if you do read it, and explore these mysteries with me. And also then you can even better understand Lynn and all these conversations and what he's saying, because he's really one of the architects of this whole new way of beginning to understand the connection of the threes beyond the threes, so to speak, past, present, future. All right. So here's a conversation with Lynn Nadel about his paper, and thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to my research ramble, and let me know what you think. All right. Bye.
So that one is fine. I don't know what.
I don't have any particular agenda.
Okay. Well. I thought, so we're going to talk about your paper. I have it printed out because, well, just because I love it, but so I can actually read the title in the right way. The Hippocampal Formation and Action at a Distance. I mean, that's a pretty exciting title.
Hmm. I should send you the talk that I gave, with that title, which
Oh, please do.
I should have thought to do this before, once you said you wanted to concentrate on that. Yeah, yeah, it's a kind of a general approach to the issue of how important it is to link things across time and space in a way that allows for causality, you might say, between things that are not directly in the same space or in the same time. So it's action at a distance. How do you get action at a distance? I mean, the physicists talk about that as something that can't happen, so to speak, or shouldn't happen. Although the quantum entanglement the talk goes into a little bit of that. It starts out with quantum entanglement. Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
and
you talk about spooky distance, Einstein in the
that's
paper
it. Yeah,
too.
yeah,
In the
yeah,
paper
that's it.
too.
So I sort of
Briefly.
I play that out a bit in the talk, and then I move
Okay.
over to that we humans, animals, are constantly doing things, that involve action at a distance. We behave based on things that happened hours ago or weeks ago or months ago, and we engage in spatial behavior based on things we don't see. We navigate to goals that we don't actually see at the moment. So somehow we have to bridge those things. We have to bridge them in order to be able to behave appropriately in space and time. But then it gets more interesting because then the question of how does learning occur? I mean, how do you connect up things in learning when there's a gap between the cause and the consequence or something like that? So, so you need a system that actually bridges those temporal gaps somehow. And the claim is that the hippocampus is sort of integral to that capacity. And in fact, there's, I think it's laid out in the paper, there's pretty good evidence that without a hippocampus, animals are not very good at bridging those temporal gaps, that the kinds of tasks that require them to do it and the sort of knowledge that you build up about the world that, is somehow a distillation of things that are separated in time and space. That without a hippocampus, you're pretty bad at those kind of things, if not hopeless. So, that's the backstory, to the general idea that, that amongst other things, and partly as a function of what it actually does by helping form memories, which is one way to bridge time, and forming cognitive maps, which is a way of bridging space, that the hippocampus permits the system, permits the organism to act at a spatial and temporal distance, so to speak, from things that it either wants to get to or wants to, make use of from the past. That's the rough claim, and it's a kind of an overarching story about what the hippocampus does and the actual things it does, forming maps, um, building representations, over multiple experiences in the same environment. Somehow you have to connect those things up. I mean, when you go back into an environment you've been in before that you only partially explored, you want to add the new information you're gaining from the second time you've gone back to that environment to the one that made last week or a month ago or whatever. Well, how do you do that? I mean, it's easy to say the words, but how does the brain actually do that? In order to do that, it's got to access the appropriate old memory. It's got to reactivate it in some way. It's got to have a mechanism for adding new information to this old memory. I mean, all of that is, those are actual steps that the system has to take in order to accomplish this ability to aggregate information over multiple experiences, that it judges to be relevant to each other, even though they're separated by time. So again, the claim is that the hippocampus allows you to do that. That actually is part of the critical machinery that allows you to stitch together those sort of temporally separate occasions that are linked by the fact that they occur in the same context or something like that. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's the idea.
It's interesting to think of action at a distance because I even think that in physics, it's discussed through motion. Like motion is affected without the two being in contact. So that's interesting with the hippocampus. But I think before, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I have the paper, I can look it up, but someone had talked about this, was it not Davenport, but had talked about action at a distance in relation to the hippocampus, and you're bringing in the spatial aspect here too, and time.
Yeah, but again, but memory is the linking device. I can't remember which paper that was. A number of people sort of raised this idea, but they never really took it all that seriously as a framework that might organize a lot of what we think about when we think about the hippocampus.
To me, this goes to, hippocampus as a cognitive map, which you and I talked about a lot, and you're building out of those ideas a lot. There's a lot about the cognitive map itself being this kind of structure that you're thinking of as doing what you just explained. And there's some part in the paper where you kind of say, yeah, we came up with all this, 45 years ago?
Yeah, it's more like 50 at this point.
50 now, yeah, because this paper
the ideas started in the kind of early 72, 71, 72. Yeah, it's over 50 years now.
Wow, that's like hard to get my head around.
Me too.
It's amazing how long it takes for people to start to understand the ideas, too.
Well, there was always some understanding of it. And then, once the grid cells came along, it really became much more popular.
That's what I mean. It's been this whole process, though, if you really think about it. It seems like, oh, yeah, that's how it went.
Yeah.
When you hear 50 years, it's like, oh, yeah, these things take time. And that's just a blip, too, 50 years. I mean, but anyway, this is kind of part of what we're talking about, right? From where we are now, this looks different. But the point is, in the paper, you say, yeah, we came up with these kind of ideas about the cognitive map and the hippocampus as a cognitive map. And over time, those have kind of played out. You and I have talked about that, and others Come on the Research podcast have talked about that as well. Over time in hippocampal research, a lot of these things have actually kind of structured even a whole area of hippocampus research in a way.
Much of it,
a lot of it.
Yeah, a lot of it.
But here's the kind of thing that's been happening that I feel like this paper is addressing, and I'd like to see where you're at now, because you wrote this 5 years ago. You say at some point, okay, all of that is happening with cognitive map theory and so on, and we're making progress, but we still don't really know how to understand the same system, the hippocampus, the hippocampal formation, whatever we want to call it. This area of the brain is doing all of this stuff with space and time, and also with memory. How do we understand all of that together? Because what's this neural system that's so intimately involved with the space and time and navigation? Do you see that as still such a question?
No, because actually the two are totally intertwined and dependent on one another, basically. I mean, for a long time, people were saying, why is this spatial navigation system happening in the same zone as memory, so to speak? But no, I think this proposal is a proposal that, it does space and time as a memory function, and that allows one to bridge gaps in space and time. I mean, let's assume that there was no memory, right? And the system was still involved in space and time and would allow you to navigate, just in your immediate environment, basically, and to string together temporal sequences of movements in an immediate environment, but you'd never remember it, and you'd never, you wouldn't have any memory from prior experiences. Basically, it's just a system, an online system for navigating in the immediate environment. Absent, okay, I mean, it might be useful. You might be able to claim there are animals where, more primitive animals where that's what the hippocampus does. It just helps the animal navigate immediately in space and time based on the things that it sees right in front of it. Maybe early, way hundreds of millions of years ago. That's what was the case. But in order to make full use of that system, and to be able to build on what experiences you have, then it necessarily becomes a memory system. You need to be able to remember, where things are in space. You need to be able to remember the sequence of things that you experienced in space. So I don't see any separation between them as if they're two different functions. Like here's color vision and here's, black and white vision, and somehow they act together, but they could be separate or something like that. Or here's vision, here's sound, and they're two completely separate things, but you can put them together sometime. The sort of the space and time notions in hippocampus kind of depend upon the idea that they are memory systems for space and time. They're not just space-time systems, they're memory systems for space and time. And those things just naturally have to go together. And when you put them together, then you come up with this idea, that when they run together, then the system will allow the organism to act on the basis of things that are distant in space and time.
So
Just like that.
I mean, I agree, but I think, even just 4 or 5 years ago, that would have sounded a bit strange because people were sort of studying memory and people were sort of studying the
Yes.
so-called GPS of the brain. We thought, oh, those, how do we put those together? It seemed like a big
Absolutely.
puzzle.
I was saying some of the same things for quite a while, that, this is a bit of a puzzle. The field is spending time trying to figure out why a system that's a memory system is also a cognitive map space-time system. But now I think it's necessary. I think for it to be of any use, it really has to be a memory system. Can't just be an online, robot that just basically deals with the immediate environment. It's got to actually create a model of the environment in space and time. And once you do that, then, then that kind of bifurcation and, the problem dissolves. It's no longer a question of how can the same system be doing these two different things. They're not two different things. They're actually inextricably intertwined.
So when we're trying to look at something that we call memory, it depends on the memory, but I mean.
Yeah, that's the point. I mean, yes, of course, there are kinds of memories that have nothing to do with space and time. So it's not that this is a system that encapsulates all memory. My memory, for how an apple tastes has nothing to do with space and time. So I've got memories for the quality of things in the world, that are totally independent of space and time. That, they're not.
But if you looked at that from another angle, I think that's what I'm trying to say. You could say, oh, I have this memory of the apple because my grandmother always gave me apples and I miss my grandmother. So that's kind of what I'm saying.
Sure.
Depends what we're looking for, how we're gonna use these.
That may be why, but I think the problem here is that the word memory is ill-defined in that equation. Here's this cognitive map of space, let's say, and then here's this memory function. And if you think of this memory function as including all kinds of memory, like, memory for the taste of an apple and so on. Now, you may have acquired that memory from a particular episode in space and time, but you probably don't even remember that. That's not a critical part of your memory for how an apple tastes. The problem is people wouldn't use the word memory to describe that. You wouldn't say, oh, I have a memory for how an apple tastes. They would say, oh, I have knowledge about how apple tastes, right? But what is knowledge but simply the accumulation of, the information we acquired into memory? So the word memory is kind of poorly articulated in these debates. I mean, the idea here is that a certain kind of memory, namely about the distribution of things in space and time, is involved with the hippocampus. Other kinds of memory, which may be parasitic on this kind, but which nevertheless exist on their own, those other kinds of memory don't require the hippocampus and don't have anything to do with space and time kind of literally, although they obviously were acquired at some point in space and time. But that's not an important part of that memory. It's now just some general knowledge you have about the properties of things in the world. The particular property that the hippocampus is concerned with in terms of memory is the distribution of things in space and time, in the past. These are the experiences I've had about the distribution of things in space and time in the past. And you build up a cognitive map based on that. So they were just completely hand in glove. It's really a hand in glove kind of thing. You can't have a cognitive map without it being a memory system, because you can't acquire a cognitive map all at once, right? It necessarily involves putting things together over time. And sometimes the time is continuous, so you could make the argument in some sense that it's a single thing, but quite frequently it's discontinuous. As I said, the example I gave before, you go into an environment, you sample some of the stuff there, you go away. 2 weeks later, you come back to the same museum and you kind of investigate a different part of that museum and you add that to your knowledge. And so, I mean, most of the time we're building up these knowledge bases about the distribution of things in space and time, over in disconnected episodes, so to speak. So it's really a problem for the brain to put all that together. So that becomes part of what the hippocampus is doing, allowing the brain to put things together that belong together because they happened in similar spaces, but at quite different times.
So if we go to the museum and we could imagine that we're there for the first time and we
Yeah.
explore it and we're sort of creating interactions with that space that when we
Yeah.
come back to that space again, we're going to interact more easily. I'll know how to go to certain.
Sure. And you do that by activating your memory for your prior experience there, right? That doesn't,
Or that's the same thing, isn't it? Like I'm not activating a memory necessarily and I'm finding my way. I'm sort of at the same time, both of those are happening, aren't they? It's not, or do you think I stand and I say, okay, now I will activate my
no, I
memory?
don't think, yeah, no, you're on the right track. I mean, this doesn't happen consciously, but it is the case, when you walk inside, say the Rijksmuseum, which, I've been to for three or four times, and don't have a very good mental map of. But, I know exactly where it is in Amsterdam. I know what the entrance to it looks like. I mean, I could easily identify it from pictures. I know if I'm walking in that general part of Amsterdam, I know exactly where it is, and I know where the Van Gogh Museum is relative to it. Hopefully, it will survive. I know it's having some financial problems. So, so when I walk into the museum, I mean, I don't consciously activate, but the cues that I get that are familiar to me will activate, whatever information, whatever knowledge I have about the layout of that museum is going to get activated just by some partial cues.
Yeah.
Then the
And
hippocampus.
that's the same process. There's not like
That's
two
all the
different
same process.
processes that we call
Yeah,
memory and we call navigation,
yeah,
but they're
exactly.
studied like that. So it can be very confusing, I think.
Unfortunately, they got separated, in the way people were studying them.
Or
But
maybe just so that we could understand them more. Because I
and
think
that's
the confusing thing is, and maybe you have some insight here, is once we go home, and it's funny you were talking about the Rijksmuseum because that's what I was imagining. So that's
yeah.
very weird, like acting at a distance there. I was literally imagining going in there because I was there not too long ago. But anyway, so like I go home, right? Now I'm home. I'm not anywhere
Yeah,
near that museum, and I can just sit here and remember.
absolutely.
And I think this is why this is becoming, at least in neuroscience, not so hard to understand that you can have something like a kind of space that you're navigating
Hmm.
as you're remembering. But I think that's still a very hard idea. So I wonder how you think of that, right? So we were at the museum and we've created these kind of cognitive maps, as you would call them. But then when I come home and remember that, what's going on there, would you say? Is it kind of just the same sort of process as when I was there?
Well,
Or
it's certainly using the same system. I mean, it's not exactly the same as when you were there because you don't have the supporting, sort of external stimulus. But yeah, it's part of the same, it's part and parcel of exactly the same system. I mean, then you replay. Essentially, you're replaying in your head or reactivating in your head, that knowledge structure, that cognitive map that you built up, when you were visiting. And that then allows you to imagine walking through the museum to, if you know the museum really well, how you get to the particular paintings you really want to see, all the kind of stuff you do when you go into a museum. Um, I think if you go back to the 78 book, we made it absolutely clear from the very beginning that what we were talking about was a memory system. We did not separate them. This is the spatial navigation system. And then there's this function of memory, which somehow, connects to it at some point. No, we were very clear right there in the first page of the book. We are talking about a memory system, right? A particular kind of memory system, that deals with space and time. So it's true that that didn't settle the debate. That didn't convince people that these things should be thought of in the same breath, so to speak. But, our commitment to that idea that those things were inextricably intertwined was there from the very beginning. I mean, when I wrote later that people are struggling with how to fit them together, that was other people that I was writing about. Other people are, spending a lot of time trying to understand how these things go together. For us, it was necessarily the case that they went together, that, that a cognitive map is a memory device.
And you also talk about Kant a lot in that book and also in this
Yeah.
paper. So, and we talked a little bit about how memory is a kind of an impossible word to
Hmm.
define, and we don't really need to define it. If anything, what this would be another conversation, but a lot of people have been trying to understand that we've come up with the word memory to discuss something that, isn't necessarily one thing. to look for a memory is kind of a bit of a strange stance to take, right? So we're not, that, let's leave that for just a minute, because space and time, to go to Kant and to go to your, 50 years of work, those are also kind of tricky words. I mean, we can go back to Leibniz and Newton, which, Kant talks about, where you have absolute space, or you have something like where space isn't about the material relations. And there's been constant arguments, not too separate from the ones we've had about memory and navigation.
I mean, I haven't, occasionally I dabble in the philosophical literature again to see what people are
You
saying.
seem to like Kant. Is he your favorite? Because he comes up.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think Kant got most things right. I mean, I think by and large, he's the philosopher, who got most things right. But, and I go back occasionally to read. People are still arguing about, absolute space versus relative space. And, it's kind of an interesting philosophical debate. But I can't say I have any new insights or thoughts about it, particularly. I think the claim we made is that we create a psychological space that fits what Kant said, not that the physical space is actually like that. I mean, in the real world, who knows what's the case? We're just talking about what the human brain, but obviously what the vertebrate brain or the mammalian brain, and not just the mammalian brain, because insects have the same thing. What brains in mobile animals do. Now, would you say do plants have a cognitive map? I would have to say the answer is probably no, right? Although I think plants demonstrate many of the same cognitive phenomena like memory, and so on that we do, but they don't have a cognitive map because they don't really need one, not for space, because they're not moving, right? Anything that moves in the world, in some intentional way, needs to have something like a cognitive mapping system in order to benefit from its prior experience. So that's a big statement, but that's just it can't be any other way as far as I'm concerned. It has to be like that. And so the philosophers are talking about, partly about, and Newton and Leibniz were talking partly about what the real world was like. But what John and I were talking about is what is the psychological world that we create inside our heads, which of course has to be consistent with what the real world is like, but it doesn't have to be exactly like it, down to the microscopic level. And we know it's not, basically. You get down to the microscopic level and the table that we think is a nice flat surface is actually rather bumpy down at the atom, the atomic level. But we don't sense any of that, and that doesn't matter. And the world may actually not conform, at various scales to Euclidean geometry, like Kant would have argued and like we argued, but that's not our problem. Our problem is to have a system that actually allows us to effectively move around and adaptively in the world that we live in. And sort of the Kantian and our, the sort of Euclidean space of Euclidean absolute space does that job perfectly well. And, from an evolutionary point of view, it's a much easier solution than kind of building the brain on, kind of non-Euclidean Riemannian geometry or some weird thing like that.
Yeah, well, a lot of those things are ways we've tried to put some kind of model or structure into the world so that we can all talk about these things. I mean, so, thinking of trying to find that specific kind of thing, like Euclidean geometry or something in anything is a bit, I mean, of course, there's arguments about all of this, and even about what Kant meant by space and time, right? Because, he talks about it as a form of intuition and it's not objective reality, but then he actually opens kind of by presenting Leibniz and Newton's views. And I imagine it this way. You can tell me how you feel, and I even imagine, as you know, your work a bit like this, but that instead of having to choose these options, we're either objectively, everything's absolutely outside or everything's absolutely inside, that there's some interactional thing going on that we're all trying to figure out. And
totally.
You got to hold that, and you can't put it into words precisely.
Yeah. Actually, we're just finishing up a paper. Me and Mary and two other colleagues are just finishing up a paper exactly on this question. Sort of the debate between inside out and outside in, the Busaki kind of argument. And this is a paper about the generation of meaning, and where meaning comes from, so to speak, and, how the brain basically represents meanings. So paper is going to be sent off for publication in a special issue of Philosophical Transactions, we think, within the next few days. So we're very much thinking about exactly how do those things come together, because even though the brain doesn't have to construct something that is sort of microscopically faithful to the outside world, it has nonetheless, in fact, evolved in that world, so it has to capture, the aspects of that world that are important to a species of a certain size, that has the capacity to move around, so it's going to be an approximation to that world, but an approximation that works, basically, that has worked evolutionarily. That means animals who have it survived and reproduced, and animals that don't have it didn't survive and didn't reproduce. So how does that external world kind of basically anchor, this internal system? So the evidence is that this internal system is hardwired. I mean, the latest evidence from the Moser lab, which of course I'm here and hearing about, in terms of the grid cell coordinates system that the grid cells provide to the whole network, that's there before rats even open up their eyes and start to move around in the world. That shows up on day 10, post independent of anything the rat has done. It hasn't opened its eyes. It's not moving around. That system, the core features of that system, the nature of the way it works, is there by day 10, independent of anything else. So that's something that presumably evolution has built. It is built in this coordinate structure that provides the scaffold, that organisms can use to attach actual experienced information to. So I have this kind of scaffold, and then I experience in the world that the table is over here, the thing is over there, and it just gloms onto this coordinate system, this hardwired system that provides the framework for thinking, effectively about space and time. And according to us, it's a Euclidean framework. Again, because it works, not because it exactly mirrors, hyperdimensional space, but because it, on this planet, in the environments that we move in and function in, it works perfectly well. It does the job, basically. And it's computationally easier than one would imagine other more complex geometries would be. Basically, it's a kind of a geometry that the system can handle, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. You see that with a lot of the body and a lot of the brain too, where you do have this sort of basic scaffolding. I mean, we're born and we are here. We have structure, and it seems very strange that we wouldn't have that structure.
Yeah, exactly.
Interacting in particular ways.
Yeah.
So,
The question is how ontogenetically, how does it emerge? Is it affected by experience? Can it be broken? Can it be changed if you have different experience and things like that? So again, the Mosers, in some experiments some years ago, they raised rat pups in a non-Euclidean environment. I think I told you about. I think we've discussed this before.
I've discussed it with people before. I was actually just about to bring it up. Yeah, and it did shift a bit.
It shifted a bit, but not in a significant way. Basically, the main framework, the main Euclidean framework remained intact. There were some minor, distortions, but it was nothing that you would, write home about. So their conclusion was no, but barring a completely dysfunctional early developmental environment, where the system itself doesn't develop the way it should, doesn't get enough nutrition or, or something like that. Barring circumstances like that, which do occasionally happen, of course, and we can do them artificially, the system will inevitably have those properties independent of specific experience. Now, it may be like as in the visual system, you need to have some input to just, jack up the activity, but it could be random input. It's just got to be something to get the system going. But the system self-organizes kind of developmentally to have those properties.
Yeah. Well, we're all in the womb and we're coming. But you brought up a couple things that are really interesting about if we don't have the hippocampus, and there's so much evidence, before we got to John and you and
Sure.
navigation and all of this, we understood, okay, the hippocampus is memory, and there's Clive Waring, or there's HM.
Sure.
And you were talking about you're kind of living in this perpetual, you talk about Corkin's book in your paper, but that, if you don't have the hippocampus, or if you have some trouble, you're almost in a perpetual present.
That's exactly right. That's the assumption. Yeah. Or
And
you're in the present, where the present is a kind of a small temporal window. I mean, whatever that window is, it's fairly maybe 20 seconds or something like that. But that's the window. That's the window where, you have a little bit of time to play with. But outside of that, you're basically out of business.
Yeah. So with these people, you can't learn something new, like how to go to a new grocery store and still remember it the next day, for example.
Right. Right.
And you won't remember it either. So both of those kind of layers
Yeah.
that we were talking about
Right.
are connected. But also, you brought up the plant, which is kind of interesting because, this is this whole controversial thing about, do other creatures have cognition? And,
Sure.
yes, they have it differently than humans, but it's interesting to think of the cognitive map, right? Because if we think of having hippocampus damage, where we can't create these cognitive maps in the way we're talking about here, and we're in the present moment all the time. And now, I'm not saying that's like a plant, because a plant is nothing like, it doesn't have a human brain, it's nothing like that. But I just planted all these crazy sunflowers this summer, and they got so tall. And, we had to kind of move them around like with the string, because they were just everywhere. And you do notice that they immediately turn. I mean, I might wake up and they've completely changed their direction and gone another way. I don't know how they grow so fast, how they change their direction, but they're in a kind of, they are moving, and they're in an interaction.
They're moving, yeah, they're interacting with the environment, in particular where the light is coming from. For
All
example.
life is sort of doing that, right?
Yeah, right. I
Isn't
mean,
that?
these are tropisms, right? I mean, there's a word for that. I mean, so they are, they alter their behavior, in a tropistic way, with regard to moisture, probably with regard to light, with regard to odor plumes. There may be a variety of things like that will influence. Certainly, plants exchange pheromones. I mean, I don't know if they're called pheromones in plants, but they influence each other by emitting stuff that, has odor, or so, basically. Yeah, I think plants are pretty cognitive, in most ways, except they just don't, because they don't move, by and large, or at least they don't move,
They don't
they move their
change their
parts.
whole position. They
They
move,
don't
but
they don't move their position, right? But they do move. They move, but not their position.
I guess
Yeah.
what I'm trying to get at is that, when we're trying to understand, like, why are we even studying all this? And in a way, it's because we want to understand how all this amazing stuff is going on,
Yeah.
how we know that we know. And I really feel like memory is such an important idea. And of course, how we find our way through the world in the most metaphorical ways and the most literal ways is so important. And I think we can get lost from that in a way. But if we just kind of for a minute just take life as it's trying to make its way through the world, and it has all these different ways of doing that, there's something about the human, right? And if we want to call it the cognitive map, or we want to think of it in other ways,
But it's not just the human. I mean, it's every
not
animal,
just the human, right? But we're talking about
pretty much every invertebrate, since the, jaw-boned fish. I mean, it goes back at least 350 million years in this lineage, that you see something that is essentially a cognitive map. That's what it, so all manner of animals. And, there's a lot of science on this. In fact, there's going to be a symposium. Are you going to be at SFN this year?
I don't know yet. I got a lot of stuff going on.
There's a lot of stuff going on. I'm not going to go probably, but there's a Carger, a Johnston Club symposium this year, organized partly by Menno Witter, who, by the way, is living outside Amsterdam now. He's moved from Trondheim. He was just up here last week, so we saw him a bit, but he's now living in a little town about 40 minutes outside Amsterdam.
Oh, wow.
I can't remember the name of it, but if
probably near me then. It's not Zeist, is it?
No, it's not that. Anyway, that workshop is about comparative approaches to hippocampus, and it's got various people in it that are going to talk about, the kind of the way in which this system has been preserved across eons, essentially. Again, because it's crucial to animals that move around in the world. Yeah, and some of the best work on this is done by a group in Seville, Cosme Salas and others, who've been studying this in lizards and turtles and fish, all that kind of. It's the same system essentially.
So there's something about locomotion.
There's something about
changes what we need
capacity. Yeah,
cognitively. The
yeah,
cognitive kind of
yeah,
composition of the being. Is that,
yeah.
can we say that? I mean, is that
Any animals that move around the world intentionally need it. Now, of course, you have animals that move around in the world unintentionally. They just
like a
get,
slime mold or something?
like molds, or or things in the ocean that just get swept around by tides. They don't actually choose where they go. They just get. So there are animals that are moved around in the world, but they don't do the moving themselves. So therefore, they don't have to make decisions about where to go, so to speak. And given that they don't have to make decisions about where to go, then they don't need a cognitive map. They just go with the flow, literally.
Yeah. Well, a slime mold is interesting though, because it does move towards a goal, and it moves the way a sunflower moves towards the light.
Yeah, it's
So,
tropistic. Then
yeah,
you right. Then you go from animals that are just moved around randomly by the
right. So there's
exigency of
no
the
linear,
world,
clean way to
right?
talk about this.
And then you move on to animals that move, according to tropisms, where you have a gradient of odor or light or temperature or something like that, and they can approach and avoid, those things based on this gradient, right? And then you move on to animals that, have much more flexibility to combine sources of information to behave in a much more flexible way in space, where they're not dependent upon an odor plume or something, or they may still use those things, but they're not dependent upon those for getting around in the world. So there's a progression, of ways in which mobile animals interact with the spatial world, all the way up to, the map idea, the internal model of the world. That's the key idea here, that animals, at some point, animals acquired the ability to form an internal model of the spatial distribution of things. That's memory, right? Right. So as soon as you put memory into this, you end up with maps.
And how do you see like an internal model as different from an activation pattern or a habit or something like that? I mean, do you?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You could make the argument that an internal model is nothing more than a bunch of habits, that they get linked
That's a
up.
lot actually to have a bunch of habits that you
Oh,
can.
yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, the argument for why it needs to be a map rather than just
Why not a mapping? A happening,
sorry.
why not a mapping? Why a map? Like do you really think of it as a noun, for example, or as a cognitive?
Yes,
It's
yes,
mapping. Right? You think of it as
yes.
something that you can actually find in the brain.
Well,
I
that's
mean, we
hard.
talked about representations before, so we don't have to
Yeah, this
go.
kind of gets to that issue. What does it mean to have a map? Um, I think about it as a thing. It may not be a thing that you can actually nail down and say, this is the thing I'm talking about, but it's a thing that exists, not just something that is built on the fly every time you're in a given situation. It's not just something that you can create, on the go. It's an actual pre-existing thing, that it's a model. It is literally a model of the world, that you can activate and use in some way. So yeah, it has a physical instantiation that if you were smart enough and had a kind of a powerful enough computer in your head, you would be able to say, well, the map is, the combined activity of these 2,473,000 neurons, which I've identified using these new neuropixel probes that allow me to record from thousands and thousands of cells simultaneously. That the model is, somehow there is a model in there. We just can't actually, it's not like a physical map. We know that, and we know that these things are distributed in ways that you wouldn't be able to point to them as a physical map, but it has all the properties of a physical map because it
Yeah,
has all the information involved, that is captured by the interactions and interrelations between the bits, that comprise the map. I mean,
yeah,
one of the interesting things, and it's in this paper, is when you don't have the hippocampus and you're trying to understand the causal relationship between things in the world. What caused what? Arguing backwards, if you have a hippocampus, you're able to make causal leaps that jump over time and space. You can say that this thing that's happening now, is related to this thing that happened, a week ago. You can do that. And you can then say, now I can derive certain properties based on combining the knowledge from those two separate experiences. If you don't have a hippocampus, you're really confined to drawing conclusions based on a much more narrow definition of what of what sort of caused what. This just simply recapitulates the argument about the relative importance of temporal contiguity, which are the things that are happening right now together, versus contingency. And contingency requires a much broader swath of time that might force you to jump across time gaps. This is in the paper.
Yeah, there's a really interesting section on it.
And this is where, and this exactly, and this is where those Davenport papers come
Right.
in, because what it means to be an organism that is completely dominated solely by temporal contiguity is to be an organism that is, in quotes, superstitious. Any two things that happen close together in time, a brain like that will assume they are causally related because that's all it's got to go on.
Yeah, Davenport and Holloway reported that rats with hippocampal damage were slaves to temporal contiguity alone and were, in effect, highly superstitious. So it's
exactly right. So and the interesting thing is I think people vary on this dimension.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are some people who jump to conclusions based on, very little input and very little data. They just happen to see that this occurred next to that. And it might have been a coincidence, it might not have been, but for some people, that's all the evidence they need. Right. Then there are people who, necessarily take a much broader swath of data into their consideration. They're using their hippocampus more to link, first of all, to get a sense of the base rate, of occurrence of these things. I mean, so it's not just that these two things ever happen close together in time. It's do they consistently happen together close in time? And how often do they happen separately from one another? So in which case, if event A happens 30% of the time and event B happens 30% of the time, are those the same 30% so that they are always together, or are they just randomly happening 30% of the time? And some of those times they're going to happen together.
Mm.
And if you're a superstitious animal and you happen to experience one of those times when A is followed by B, you will conclude that A causes B or that A leads to B. You will not take into account the fact that A happened a lot on its own and B happened a lot on its own, because that requires bringing in information that is not right here and now. That requires acting at a distance, right? So in order to bring that information this is what Rescorla and Wagner kind of were all about, basically pointing out that it was contingency.
Yeah.
It's contingency and not temporal contiguity that kind of determined learning. What Davenport stuff shows is that, yeah, that's true in an animal with a hippocampus, but in an animal without a hippocampus, they're not Rescorla-Wagner animals. They're Skinnerian animals, or they're whatever, Hullian animals. They just basically behave on, what just happened in temporal contiguity. That's the driver, basically.
Yeah, I love this part of the paper, and I think it's such an important thing right now to think about in a lot of ways, because you also bring up the future in this paper a lot. And, because we're remembering and imagining are not that different, actually. We're doing something very similar.
Yeah, we assume so. Yeah.
And this is why I bring up, do you really think the map is a thing? And why I think that's an important question, and a very, why you and I have talked about these things, representations and so on. But let me just be messy here and you correct me or just say what comes, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it matters a lot right now. And I want to try to understand it. I've been trying to understand it. So you talk about, it can sound like there's a little map that we sort of use and that it's solid. And I know you're not saying that, but also it's not, everything that we're experiencing is changing kind of that immediate map or mapping is what I would prefer.
Okay.
But there's layers of this because, just as we're like, if you and I go for a hike and a snake comes out and I move out of the way, I didn't think about it, but I knew to move out of the way. But also, we do that in our memory too, or in our thinking or in our remembering. We can be lost in thought, for example, or we can know that we are thinking about something. So there's you talk about this in the paper, how it's not linear and you're trying to open up to different ways. And I think it's very hard, but I think also when we're thinking about mapping, because those are, if we generalize that to the way it's talked about in everyday life, we think we have these memories which are true or false, and and we pull them out, and we can compare them, and it actually isn't working like that, which is why
No. And I think more people are
it's
understanding.
mapping. It's almost like the hippocampus allows us to communicate with ourselves or something.
Well, yes, but also to constantly update our own knowledge,
Which is a kind of communication.
which
I mean,
is a kind of communication
and
with
I don't
each.
mean there's a thing sitting in our head communicating. It's a whole body.
Yeah. I think that's a
Experience.
reasonable way to think about it. Absolutely. And I think the field in general, the memory field in general, is moving towards this much more dynamic understanding of what, memory really is and does. It's not a fixed thing. It's constant. Your memories, you are your memories. Your memories are in constant dialogue with the real world,
With
basically.
everything you're putting in, whatever you're
Yeah,
watching on YouTube,
exactly right.
whatever you're
Exactly right.
reading, the people
Right.
that are around you, those are shifting the algorithm, so to speak.
All the time.
You
Yeah,
know?
absolutely.
This is very important. I don't know if we, to talk about the superstitious thing that you brought up, I don't know if we realize how that's happening, that
No, I don't think we
we're
understand
doing
it
that
at
to
all.
ourselves through what
Yeah.
we surround
Yeah.
ourselves with. Or,
Sure, I don't
the
think
way
we
we've been talking.
understand that at all. But I mean, I think we're working towards it, but a lot of the effort now is towards trying to understand exactly, what are the consequences of this dialogue, basically between our existing self and the new stuff that we're constantly being exposed to that forces a dialogue of the sort you're describing. How does that work? I mean, how does the system constantly updating itself, so that it stays true to the current reality rather than just basically reflecting what used to be, what might still be, but might not be anymore. So
Yeah,
this
because everything's always changing.
everything in the world is changing, right?
Yeah.
Now, some of it's changing at a scale that it doesn't matter. We don't have to, it doesn't matter to us that
You have to think about it. Yeah.
that we can't step into the same water in the river. It's still the river, right? It's not the same
Yeah.
water exactly. The molecules are different, right? So that's that old example that scale doesn't matter, but there are scales that it really does matter. That there are changes that really now the river no longer flows in this direction. But because of a flood, it now flows in that direction. Okay, that's something we better be aware of, so to speak, and
Yeah. Do you
and
feel,
all of
Lynn,
that.
we're trying to become aware of that in a different way now than we've
I
ever
think the
had
field is
as
very
humans?
much focused on this question of the dynamics of memory, how memories are, constantly changing as a function of current experiences. That's what I'm
And
focused
how that affects the future, because I think
on.
that's the
Well,
thing too, when we were talking about trying to hold both things at once, that
yeah.
we're also having to realize that what we're remembering is also what we're imagining or putting forward in a way. They're not the same thing, but in the way we're talking about, they're very connected. And also, that's the difference between the sunflowers in my backyard that don't move and the reason that we need to have these mappings and be aware of them, because
Right. Now
it's a different
they
kind
may
of movement.
predict those sunflowers may actually have enough of a memory, so to speak, that they like a 24-hour clock, let's say. So that they will predict when they ought to shift, according to where the sun is in the sky. I don't know if that's true or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were capable of that because that's just a timing
They're
mechanism.
definitely moving in relation to everything that we do and
Well,
that happens. So
what
it's so much
happens if you
more immediate than
take them out of the sun and put them in a place where there's constant illumination and see if they still move, on some regular basis according to the clock that they would have moved, if they were out there in the real world. I mean, how built in is this circadian kind of rhythm, basically? I mean, a lot
yeah,
of it again it has been so built in over evolutionary time because fundamentally the cycles of light and dark haven't changed, right? Uh,
right.
in a given biome, depending on where
Yeah.
these plants are
The
living.
regularities that shift are much smaller than what we're dealing with once we get to what we're talking about now. So, I mean, of course, we have the sunflower-ness in us too, right? We have these kind of, rhythms, but
We do, yeah.
we've also developed this way of communicating with ourselves and communicating with each other and all that happening at once and
Yeah.
needing these ways to, scaffold all of that stuff. And that feels to me really important, especially when we think about this kind of a paper and action at a distance.
Yeah.
How we're all, how we're all doing this for each other in strange ways right now, that we are trying to see more clearly. Do you,
Hmm. Good
and
luck with that.
it's so messy. Yeah.
Yeah, good luck with that part. Yeah, no, I agree. But certainly the dynamics of memory and the way in which we update our knowledge, and the systems that allow us to do that and so on, that's kind of a focus that I'm focusing on that right now. And I'm not the only one. There's quite a few people who are. mean, we're just about to publish a paper in TINS, just got accepted a couple of days ago, on the role of the locus coeruleus in orchestrating, you know, this updating ability and sort of influencing it, whether you update a memory or whether you decide, nah, this really isn't related to my prior experience. This is a new experience, and I'm going to create a separate memory for this thing. Well, that's a fundamental decision the brain is making, all the time. How does it do that? How do so and when it decides to update, what are the mechanisms that determine how it updates a memory so that it sort of deletes the things that are no longer relevant and adds new things that are now relevant, versus when it's creating a brand new memory, how does it keep it separate from this older memory that you initially activated because you thought that was what the situation was going to be. I mean, those are all choices the brain has to make, as it continues to try to build internal models that will work in the future. It's all pointed towards creating models that will be adaptive in the future.
Yeah, and it's not just the brain, it's the body and us in
And it's all of
communication
it.
about it now too.
Yeah, it's all of it.
So yeah. Well, has it helped you? I mean, do you have any? I don't think I've asked you about love yet, and this is love and philosophy. So I have to finally, Lynn, ask you about that word. And do you see any relation at all to the work you
I
do
don't have
in
any,
that?
I have no insights into it. I struggle. I have
But
no,
but all this work that you've done, we talked about 50 years ago, you guys were writing this book, and
yeah.
is there something about what you do that connects to care and to like thinking that it's,
I
or do
don't
you just, you just do it?
I wouldn't say in any direct way. I mean, beyond the fact that, having a reasonably good model of the world, I would say allows you to behave more appropriately, contextually appropriately, when, restaurant voice versus home voice, all these things that you do that are contextually appropriate, that are socially important, that kind of depends upon this system in a way, but it's not really, I don't think understanding this system will give us much of a handle on, you know, on compassion or resilience or any of those things. I think they're really in another zone, basically. This is a more kind of purely cognitive, purely knowledge-based system, that can be deployed to, in useful ways in all of those social domains. And there really are parts of the hippocampus, CA2 in particular, that are very important for social interactions. We know that social stuff gets caught up in the system, but I don't know that this hippocampal formation system makes fundamental contributions to those things. It makes these kind of contextual contributions and so on, shadings, but I don't think it helps me understand emotion at all, quite honestly. I wish that that were not true, but I don't think it helps me understand the basis of emotion, the basis of any of these sort of more socially oriented cognitions. I mean, I don't consider emotion separate from cognition, but the emotional side of our cognitive life, I think is really not so much in the zone of the hippocampus. But because of what it does, it influences a lot of that. I mean, I keep reading papers where people claim the role of the ventral or anterior hippocampus is anxiety, and basically all of the behavioral tests that they tend to use are ones that measure anxiety from being in open spaces or being in places that
Mm,
are
right.
fearful. So it's not so much about anxiety, but it's about the kind of anxiety that comes from being in a space that you're uncomfortable in. So somehow, you know, the notion of this of space gets caught up in with anxiety, but it isn't. But there are plenty of anxieties that have nothing to do with space. You're anxious when you see a spider and you don't know why. I mean, that doesn't matter where you are, right? So I don't think it's fundamental to those things, but I think it can intertwine with those things under some circumstances. There's a Venn diagram overlap between, the role of facial models of the world and these other things, that remain to.
I lost you. I lost you. I lost you, Lynn. I can't hear you or see you. Are you still there?
Yeah, I think my system kicked out basically, and I
Yeah.
don't know just at that moment. But anyway, the hour is up. So I
Yeah.
actually thought initially that your system kicked out, but then I saw that I was suddenly offline briefly. I don't know why.
Yeah. I don't know. But I think we got most of it. But oh, you're frozen again.
I think we're I think we're back in connection, but I now have to.
Yeah, and me too. I just wanted to
All
say,
right.
if we did think of the hippocampus as like a way that we're somehow connected to communication in the way we were talking about, then it would also make a lot of sense to those points you were making about possibly extending the circle of care. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, sure, but it's a stretch, but it's a stretch that I'm happy to see you make. But
Yeah, well,
I
I'm making it, so
good. Go for
based
it.
on your research or building
Yeah.
upon. So, all right.
Good.
Well, thanks for
I look
today. I
forward to
really
hearing
appreciate
it.
it.
Okay, we can connect up again in sometime in a few more months, when I'm back in Tucson temporarily. So I'll be back in about 10 days and settling in. I'll be pretty busy through October and November. Then the whole family is kind of what, it's going to be in and out,
Yeah,
and we're a lot of things
holidays.
going on back in Tucson, not to, and in America, that et
Yeah.
cetera. So I don't know what that's all going to be like, but we can stay in touch, and we'll try to set up another time sometime down the road.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to it. I want to read the paper
Yeah.
that's coming out too. That might be a good one to talk
Yeah,
about.
prod me to send you a copy of this paper on
Okay, and that
locomotion.
video. I want you to send me the video of this paper
Oh, yeah, send me an
or the
email
talk. I'll email you
reminding me of
with
the
some
things
other
I
stuff too.
promised you.
Okay.
Okay. All
Thanks
right.
a
Take
lot,
care.
Lynn. Be well.
All right. You
Appreciate it.
too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.